All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first ever Cornell University from Qatar versus St. John's University debate. Today, they've come a very long way, and we'll hope we're going to have a great debate today on the motion, this House would support gender quotas in parliaments or national assemblies. I now invite the Prime Minister, Timothy Barr, to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Stay here. The official timekeeper today will be Alicia. This one.
I'm glad to see that today's debate has 50% representation of both genders. What we want to talk to you about today is the unique burden that parliaments and national assemblies have in representational democracy. That burden is very clearly a proportional representation of the interests of the populace. And when women make up 50% of the population, we see a failure on the parts of parliaments and national assemblies in countries that do not have gender quotas to meet this kind of burden of proportional representation. So the model that we'll bring to you today is really not a model at all. We think that the Moroccan system or the UK system, either of these are fine. Whether you want to reserve seats or whether having a balanced ballot for both women and men in the elections, either of those are fine. What we are defending is an effort to represent have a proportional representation of men and women, of a 50% balance in these assemblies and other places. So first, I want to talk to you a little bit more about this burden of proportionate representation. First of all, parties in these bodies represent interests. They represent interests in ways that are different than women's interests are. They represent interests of a particular ethnic minority, like the Kurds in Iraq, who would never be satisfied by being represented by Sunnis. But both of these parties, because their interests are localizable by ethnicity, by a particular kind of ideology, by a particular kind of geography, that they often are able to ignore women's issues, because women's issues are pervasive throughout society. There are Kurdish women, and there are also Sunni women that are affected by the same issues. And because these parties disagree, they do not represent these women's issues in a unique way. Because women's interests are not localizable, there cannot be such a thing as a women's party that would be half of a parliament. Because of this, we see the need for gender quotas within each of the parties to have 50% representation of women's issues so they can address those issues within their party's platform and affect those parties' platforms to make sure that they address women's issues.
Women will still be part of parties, so they will still have to put these regional and ethnic interests before they put ahead women's interests, right?
Not necessarily. Not at the point that you have 50% representation of women in the body as a whole. Because so one of the things that we see in parliaments and national assemblies that people do, they can have special caucuses. They can have different types of assemblies where they can meet together from different parties, just having women meet together and say, we want to talk about women's issues. We want to bring these things up. And we also think that each representative has the ability to stand on the floor and deliver in assemblies and national assemblies and parliaments what they want a particular law to be. They have the ability to legislate. They have the ability to talk across the aisle. We think that this is an important thing to do, especially in countries where women's interests are unrepresented. We don't think that parties will be interested, and I'll talk about this later, to suppress women's issues anymore at the point that they are required to have women on the ballot. Okay, so we also think that many of these parties don't even have stances in countries where women aren't represented very well or at all. They don't have stances, and we think that for these assemblies to be legitimate, they have to have some kind of strong, legitimate stance on issues that affect women. Such things as like women's health, as in prenatal care, as in often issues on poverty, which disproportionately affects women rather than men. We think that these parties currently have an interest, even amongst each other, and fighting amongst each other to ignore these issues because women are not represented. We think that when women are there and their constituents, who are also women, feel more comfortable approaching women assembly members, which is also what I want to talk about, they're more likely to get that kind of representation. So when you are a representative and you're a man, in a place where there's a strong patriarchal system, and we see that the vast majority of this is what's going on, the women constituents are unlikely to approach that man because of the patriarchal norm in that society. They're unlikely to go to the representative and say, please represent us on this issue. Please represent us on this specific agenda that we want to have. Then what we see is that in the communities, as the liaison between the representative and the people, largely the discussion happens between male constituents and the representatives. We think that this is insufficient because the voices of women are being stifled before they even get into the assembly, being stifled in the community where women are not allowed even to approach men without being with a male guardian member who might not have the same interest of them, even if they are married or not. Go.
So you're talking about how women are not represented in these countries where women's issues are completely underground and suppressed because women are not comfortable in approaching men. But don't you realize that in these societies you don't have a parliament to begin with? It isn't representative system. So how are you going to put them into power?
That's not necessarily true. We've seen these gender quotas be effective in Morocco, have extreme kinds of effects in Morocco, where you had a monarchy, then you had a parliament that was entirely with males, and then you had gender quotas where women were able to be represented in there. And then we saw great progress on women's issues in Morocco, even though there may be patriarchal understandings in some of the areas of Morocco. We think that this is a possibility even in these kinds of questions. We think that many countries where there's patriarchal systems often have democratic bodies. We don't think that there's a one-to-one correspondence between authoritarianism and sexism. We think that these occur in almost every society in the world, and they should be in every society. Okay. So then, what are the effects that we think are going to happen because of this? Then representational democracy. What are the problems with men representing women? Well, the oppression of women comes from men. We see in ethnic quotas that Kurds would not be satisfied with Sunni representation because of the long-standing conflicts between them in these areas. We think that this also applies to men and women, and for those same reasons, you cannot simply have men representing women and women's issues because there is this long-standing conflict. At the point that there's a long-standing conflict, we've seen in many places, like in Lebanon, that you have issues that say we need different kinds of ethnic quotas, or in Iraq that says we need ethnic quotas. We think that here there have been long-standing conflicts between men and women in many of these countries. That is the history and the nature of sexism and oppression. This long-standing conflict has also been said, oh, it's not really a long-standing conflict, so we don't need a different kind of representation. We want to say that it is. We also think in the patriarchy, for example in Taiwan, where traditional women's roles means that women cannot find campaign support because male politicians say, you really don't belong here. You belong either in the academy or you belong at home washing dishes. We see at the point that now that men have to support women in their campaigns, we're going to see money being given to female campaigns by these parties who have to support them because they have to have a certain number of women. Which we're going to see means we're going to see more women's representation in the public sphere. And we're going to see good representation of women in the public sphere because parties don't want their female candidates to look bad. They want to make sure that they look good. This is, in many countries, will be the first time that women will be on television. In a public light, having a public duty, and represented in a good light. I think this is an extreme benefit for the rights of women in these places, where we see female leadership being extremely important to be represented. When Indira Gandhi became Prime Minister of India, this was rallying for many of the women in the communities to say, I also can run for political office. These are the benefits for our side. For all these reasons, we are proud to
Thank the Prime Minister, and now invite the Leader of the Opposition, Afnan, to present the opening opposition's case. Here.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. As we have heard from side government, apparently there's going to be some sort of 50% representation of women. And first of all, I'm going to start showing you how this model, this more or less, not model as they said, but policy wouldn't work in the countries that they talked about. And then I'm going to go on to how what is it called? These quotas are not in essence democratic in any way. And furthermore, how it's going to affect the candidates that are going to be in the parliament. Now, firstly, we heard there's going to be a 50% representation of women and how women are going to get their rights just because they're on the parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, what about those countries who do not have a 50-50 ratio of men and women? How about a 1-to-1 ratio? What about countries like China, where the population ratio is 7 boys to 1 girl? How is that in any way a representative of the population? Because effectively, you are trying to elect eligible candidates onto these parliamentary boards and onto these parliamentary boards. What's it called? To represent the population and what the general nation wants. Secondly, and so I'm going to move on onto how this is not more or less democratic, because the population should be voting for an eligible candidate regardless of the gender. So if a man is going to come up here and say, I'm going to give these women rights, and which effectively will happen, what is it called? The assigning quotas to assigning a number of seats in the parliament to women, you're going to undermine the amount of the representation of the nation, and you're going to undermine eligible candidates that could not get to the parliament because the quotas are either filled up or they don't exist for that particular set. And the example that was given by the Assad government was Lebanon, where each sect is given a number of representatives, which is given a number of representatives. Ladies and gentlemen, Lebanon's government is failing because of those quotas. And if you're going to put, it is torn and weak, and it's ineffective because at any point you're going to have people who just want to resign, and like I said before, certain candidates can't run because the quotas are either going to be filled up, even if they are more qualified. So a more qualified man wants to run, the quota is already filled up, and you're going to have a certain number of seats for women who might not be eligible. And on the issue, in a minute, sir, on the issue of the empowerment of women, of how their rights are going to be taken into consideration, we're not saying that women shouldn't be in the government to represent women in the population. We are saying that it possibly isn't. Offering the quota itself is not going to be the way to represent them.
In a country like Taiwan, until recent measures about gender quotas were put in place, what they would always pass over the more qualified woman for a man because of the nature of gender roles in that country. Those roles in the country themselves, just because, like I said, if they are more qualified, then they don't need quotas to go to. They don't need quotas to be better than men, and that's exactly what I was going to say. So instead of offering these quotas, where you're going to have a reserved number of seats for women, we are proposing to by opposing this motion that instead we are inspiring women to be competitive with their male counterparts, become better than them, and instead of reserving seats, they can deserve those seats, deserve to be a representation to represent the population. No, sir. An example of this is in Jordan. There's probably only one woman on the ministry parliament, and women issues are addressed, even though 99% of the candidates are men. And this comes effectively because they are not, the rights of women are not as undermined as the government is implying. The differences in political parties, and just because there are conflicts between Sunnis and Shias and Kurds, it doesn't empowering women has become a lot more common nowadays. Even on that side of the world, you are having women who are being empowered, regardless of political differences. In Saudi Arabia, women were just given the right to vote, but they still can't vote for any women because there are no women running. Do you think that's because in the merit-based system of Saudi Arabia, no women were qualified to run?
Not exactly, but in all honesty, the Saudi for Saudi Arabia to offer the rights to vote to women forming a quota is not going to give the answer. If women's rights are already being addressed in Saudi Arabia, so Saudi women are given free healthcare, free prenatal care as well. They're given probably one of the only things that is not given to them is the right to drive. But that is due to more cultural scope. But all in all, and you don't need a man to represent the will of the Saudi Arabian women, because Saudi Arabian women already tell the government, we want to drive, we are driving, whether there are men or women on the parliament or not. And so, we oppose this motion because you don't need a set number of seats for women to represent women. Women can have their voices heard and be represented by
the opposition to that speech, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister Nelson to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Here, here.
What I'm going to bring to you today is the argument of how different political opinions and opinions of dissent from women about female issues are excluded from Parliament when you don't have a quota, because these women don't get elected because this meritocratic system that they present to you simply doesn't exist within these cultures. First, let me do a little bit of rebuttal. We heard from opening opposition, what about places in which there's 7 guys to 1 girl ratios, like in China? First, we tell you that that's only in some cities in China. It's not representative of China as a whole. But secondly, we tell you that our model allows for a different type of quota systems we have. You can have just as many female candidates as you do male candidates and so forth, right? But then we heard about how this is undemocratic, because we're taking away from good political candidates. We tell you that our model we tell you the same thing with our model that how it solves this. But secondly, we tell you that they assume that these female political candidates are going to be somehow bad or worse than male candidates who are being elected in the status quo. We tell you that the reason why female candidates aren't elected oftentimes in some places are because the cultural norms against electing female representatives. Not necessarily that the woman is a worse candidate. But then this also is thirdly they assume that the male will somehow make better policy because he's a man, or simply because he's elected. We tell you that women who are elected because often quota systems, like in Morocco, can have just as great policies. But furthermore, we tell you that they have specific impacts of specifically female policies that men can't achieve. And because women are such a huge part of the voting bloc and are such a huge part of the movement affected by these policies, we think that we need female voices who are represented and are sitting and making these decisions also. But then we heard lastly that we need to make sure that these people deserve their seats. We'll tell you that system of meritocracy is only legitimate when these people have equal starting positions. We'll tell you that in many societies, women don't have equal starting positions as men to say oh, this is a meritocratic system, so they deserve their seat in Parliament. We'll tell you that we say that simply doesn't exist. Then we'll also get into the harms of even if how this is perceived by our society. We think that's what they were trying to get at here. If they don't have these seats that are deserved, then society perceives this harm as negative, or sees them as simply just there because of the quota system. We'll tell you that even if they're perceived as there because of a quota system, that can still be a benefit on our side of the house. Because we can say we can still have the symbol of power for women to have is still particularly important, because we say that we can impact other women within society at large in general. But then furthermore, we can tell you is that this doesn't take away from their ability to actually legislate change and legislate policies, even if they're simply seen as symbolic. Because no matter what the perception of them is, it doesn't take away the one vote that they're going to have when it comes to making the important policy decisions. So it doesn't matter about the perception at the point where they can implement actual policy change. We say that this policy change will be a good thing. So, how do we think that we're going to be forcing dissents into the parliamentary system in which it wasn't there before? We say that in the status quo, political views are being suppressed because we don't have as many women in parliament, right? We give you an example such as Saudi Arabia. Even where they've gotten the right to vote, you still haven't gotten the right to vote without your husband's permission. You still need your husband's permission. We say that political voices, such as saying, how come I need my husband's permission to vote within Saudi Arabian parliament, are missing. We say that when we have quotas for women in the Saudi Arabian parliament, that they can bring this voice up there. They can bring this voice up. We say that the impetus for men to bring this voice up within the Saudi Arabian parliament is very small. Why? Because they don't want to give up the power that they currently hold. They don't want to give up the power that they hold over another minority group. We say that when you put the minority group in power and say that we're not a minority group, we're just as many as you are, right? And we don't need your permission to go out and vote. We don't need your permission to do other things. We don't need your permission to do other things in society. We say that that's a good thing to have. Go ahead.
Okay, you just analyzed how men have so much power over women in these societies. What makes you think that male party leaders will allow women to enact any meaningful change in these societies, given your analysis?
Like, you don't have a choice at the point where the woman has the vote in parliament, right? Like, it's not like you can say, like, oh, don't vote for that. Like, she's not going to cast absentee ballots every single time. But furthermore, we tell you is that, like, these cultural pressures can still be solved for on our side of the house. Because we say that it's better to fight cultural pressures, not by simply ignoring that they don't exist, not by saying, like, oh, time is going to heal all your wounds, etc., but by making sure that we say that women can have positions of power, women can legislate these changes, and so can legislate these changes, that they can make great policy decisions. We think that's a very important thing that we gain on our side of the house that they simply ignore. But furthermore, what we would tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that in these parliamentary systems, the types of political decisions that people will be making are like decisions that Tim talked about, right? To things such like prenatal care, postnatal depression care, and so forth. We say that in these parliamentary systems, when it comes time for spending cuts, these are things that are oftentimes cut first because there's no representation of that issue. Because there's no female voice on that issue to actually represent that issue, because they know what that voting bloc actually feels like. We say that the party politics on their side of the house that they're playing don't have to care about specifically female issues. The reason why they don't have to care about specifically female issues is because there's no one there to enforce that. We say that when you put females in these positions of power to enforce specifically female issues, then we can actually legislate and form some forms of political change. Lastly, what we'll tell you is that because women are such a massive voting bloc, because women are such a massive bloc of the populace as a whole, this necessitates that we have this action. And this necessitates why it's necessary for quotas. Not just to let this organic, like, oh, I'm going to vote for the best candidate, like opening opposition trying to bring. Why? Because the candidates that they have aren't ones that are free, like women can run and everything, right? Because we see that oftentimes female candidates are suppressed, like the political leaders that Quinn tried to bring up in the POI, who try to suppress female voices. And the status quo, they're suppressed at the point where they can't even run. So the choices aren't even there for females to make. We say we take away that level of suppression, and then we say that now female candidates are actually on the ballot and can be voted on. We say that this is particularly important. Why? Because when they can actually be voted on, then we say we've broken that level of suppression. But secondly, when they're put in parliament, we say that it's very hard to just say like, oh, don't vote on this issue. We see that these female political leaders will have very strong ties with the people who voted them into office and will still want to act on their behalf, and will still want to act on the behalf of women. We think that this is a good political change to have. Ladies and gentlemen, because we think we're going to be forcing into descent into a political system that didn't have these political voices in the first place, and putting in the voices that were otherwise always marginalized, Tim and I are very proud to
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech, and now invite Lama to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, St. John's, for having us. To begin, I'm going to rebut some of the points that the opposition has brought up, and then I'm going to go into the main substantial part of my argument, which is basically how this will turn societies further against women rather than make them for women, and also how this quota is an empty promise to women. So, to begin with, they gave the example of Saudi Arabia and how some women now have the right to vote, but there are no women in parliament to vote for. Well, first of all, Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, ladies and gentlemen, so voting really has no meaning there in the first place. So giving women a quota on these parliaments will literally do nothing except give them the image of power, which is really not what we're aiming for. Second of all, let's take a country like Kuwait where women are in parliament. They say that women in Saudi Arabia still have to ask their husband's permission to go vote. Well, women in Kuwait still have to ask their husband's permission to go into parliament. So literally they're changing nothing. Just because the women in parliament doesn't mean they have been empowered. Their husbands still have some sort of say over their power. So second of all, they're talking, and this goes into my second point, but let's just put it out there. They want to give women these quotas because it will give them the symbol of power, that women have this power. Well, first of all, on side opposition, we don't want women to have a symbol of power. We want to have actual meaningful power. We want them to actually have a say and make change in their societies. For example, if we take the example of Yemen, which is going through a revolution right now, it is the Yemeni women that are out in the streets going like, down with the regime. We do not want we do not want you up there anymore. We want our voice to be heard. It is a Yemeni woman that has won the Nobel Peace Prize recently. So really, women in these areas that they want to give them, that they want the quotas to apply for, that need these quotas, really are empowering themselves. You do not need to give them these quotas. And in fact, by giving them these quotas, you're going to regress them back into a position where they have to ask the parliament to give them these rights rather than take them for themselves. And second of all, this symbol of power will be like the Emancipation Proclamation in the US. It was an empty promise, it did nothing, it changed nothing. So, to go into my first point, which is how giving women this quota will further stigmatize them in their societies, especially in societies where they claim that the quotas are needed. Let's take the example of Lebanon that they so bravely brought forward. The government in Lebanon literally is ineffective. They resigned, there was no government for 3 months, nothing changed in the country. It is that ineffective. It does nothing. It is a symbol, which is what we don't want. Okay? Giving quotas to specific people and not having people who are maybe more qualified, even though they come from a different sector, is not the way to go. If these people wanted to be representative, then they need to inspire a representative of their own to go forward, to present their own views, and also not only present them in a symbolic way, but in an actual way that has power within the society.
You don't have any power if you're an independent candidate that has no financing for your campaign and is running as the only women in all the ballots.
Thank you. Well, they're saying that you're not going to have power if you're an individual woman. Yet they want the quota to represent all women in the society. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if a woman in Saudi Arabia decided to go and vote, to go and try and get into these mock parliaments, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, she will have the support of every single female in Saudi Arabia. So saying that just because an individual candidate decides to go in, they're not going to get into a seat, that's an obvious statement, ladies and gentlemen, because in order to be on parliament, you have to be representative of some sort of group, and by being representative, you're going to have their support. So this is how, so if we put these women in this mock position of, if we give them the quota and put them into this mock position of power, it's simply going to turn society against them. Because any bad decisions that the government makes, especially that the parliament makes, especially in areas like this, will be blamed on the woman. Franz Kafka once said in his book, 1,007 Sons, wherever a man's accusing finger points, it will land on a woman. If the parliament makes a mistake and these women are given quotas and not representative by the people that they are supposed to be representing, then any mistake the parliament makes will be blamed on this woman and not the parliament as a whole. And this will turn the views of society against the women even more, make them more stigmatized, try to oppress them more. Their husbands, when these women go home, their husbands will somehow influence their views. Just because you put them in parliament doesn't mean you're actually giving them power.
All you need to do is look at the voting record and see if women voted in the same way as their male leaders did. On one side, you're saying they're going to vote exactly the same, and then say that the male leaders will blame them all and everything. We can't have it both ways.
Order.
To move on to my second point. Giving women this quota will be an empty promise. It is saying, look, we're giving you your rights. Go sit on this parliament. But really, you're not going to have any power. You're not going to have any actual change. Especially in a system where they say it's going to be a 50-50 vote. So if all the women vote one way and all the men vote another, how is there going to be any change? So giving them this quota is trying to sort of scrub the mess under the carpet. It's just hiding. It's a surface change. It doesn't change the actual reality of these women's conditions. It doesn't change the actual reality of the fact that they are powerless within society. because they're going to be in a government, in a parliament that A, has no power, especially in the areas that they're talking about, and B, they're going to be in a position where they are going to be blamed for any mistake this parliament makes, despite the fact that it might not even be their fault. So it is for these reasons that we proudly oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that speech. Now move the debate to the second half of the table, and I invite, who is it? Alonzo? Diala.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're first going, my main extensions are going to be 4 main points, which are going to be expanding on the interests of women, the effects on women in society, the advantages to everyone, both men and women, and long-term effects. However, before I move on to those points, we're first going to address some of the fallacies that have been brought up by the opposition. To begin with, they gave the example of China. However, we'd like to point out that China is based on gender inequality. And they gave the fact that there's 7 men to 1 woman. You can't base things on countries like China where gender inequality already exists. And the whole purpose of this motion is to fix this gender inequality, to give women the right to have their voices heard. Secondly, they spoke on how by keeping it as it is right now, we're going to be inspiring women to work harder so they deserve those seats. However, we ask you, why would women be inspired to work so hard if they know that their chances are so small? You gave the example of Jordan, where only 1 woman is in a governmental position. What's going to be the motivation for young girls to be able to work so hard for just that 1 seat? There isn't going to be that motivation. You're not going to have women in the parliament. They're not going to work hard towards that because their chances are so small. Secondly, or thirdly, they gave the example of Saudi and how it's going to have an image. It's only going to be an image of power. However, we ask the opposition to look at the population and to look at the women. Women are completely oppressed, and even if, for example, you do have just an image of power, let there be an image of power to these women. Let them have something to think that they finally have their rights. They finally are not oppressed. Let them have that joy. Let them have that motivation. No, thank you. And then they went on to give an example of Kuwait, where you're going to be changing nothing, as women still have to ask for permission. However, at least you're still giving them the opportunity. If from 9 women that want to run, if from 10 women that want to run, only 1 does run, that's 1 woman who's running who wouldn't have run before. That's 1 woman that you have on parliament that you wouldn't have had unless you move on with this policy. And then they spoke about how if anything goes wrong, that wrongdoing was going to be blamed on women. However, how you basically in its essence they're supporting gender inequality and sexism. Of course, you're not. It's bad to blame things on women. That whole argument is based on the fact that women that men are superior to women, and so that doesn't make any sense to us because the whole point of the government is to avoid sexism and to help combat gender inequality. And with that, we'll move on to our main points. No, thank you. The first one being that we're going to expand on the women's interests. And as it's already been brought up by the opening government, why do we appoint leaders? And we appoint them to represent interests. And in this case, we're going to be representing the interests of women. And therefore, there's going to have their rights met and their needs met. And with that, we give you the example of India. In India, in small villages, in the rural areas of India, when the man dies, the woman is also killed. We ask you, why does this happen? This happens because in those villages, nearly 100% of the women in these of the governmental populations in those villages are men, and therefore the women's rights and needs aren't met because the positions aren't by any woman, and therefore these women are being unjustly treated. And this, although this is an extreme example, this is an example of why it is so important to have women on these governmental policies. Yes.
Are you suggesting that the Indian villages will be represented the entire world as a whole, especially Saudi Arabia?
I specifically said this is an extreme example. However, this is still an example. Moving on to, and also we'd like to move on to the fact that more women are going to be compelled to vote because of the fact that now women are in the parliament. And with that, we bring you the importance of setting a quota itself. By setting a quota, for example, of the 50%, you're going to be having, of those 50, for example, if there's 100 seats, from those 50 seats, you're going to have 50 different women. What that's going to mean is you're going to be representing all of the needs of women. So there are cases where they said, Jordan, there's still 1 seat for a woman, that 1 seat is not going to represent all of the women. And that's why it's so important to have 50%, and that's why it's so important to have have equal number of seats. Because even with one seat, you're still not representing all the rights of women and all the needs of women. And secondly, our next point, which are the effect on women, and this is our main point why we are so with this motion, is the fact that you're going to be giving women in population aspirations. And women are going to be more motivated towards something. Moving back again to the example of Jordan, we dare you to find one girl in a kindergarten class that says, I want to be a president. In fact, we double dare you. You're not going to find girls in Jordan saying, I want to be a politician, whereas men are going to be saying. So with that, competition on. And moving on from that, the fact that because they're going to be more aspired, they're going to be more happy, they're going to be more satisfied, they themselves are going to be more happy with the government. They're going to have a happier, smilier population, and that is also extremely important. Yes?
So all your arguments assume the idea that women will be able to enact meaningful legislation, which will result in a better empowerment of women.
I completely disagree with you. Of course, one point of it is that there's going to be legislation. The other point is there's going to be motivation. There's going to be something that the women are going to benefit from in the population. Not simply the people that are also going into the governmental positions, but also the entire women population in the society. For example, Saudi, where women are going to be more happy and more satisfied with themselves and with the feeling of not being oppressed anymore. And our next point that we're going to review is the advantages to the entire society. And that's more with the men and women that are in parliament. The main thing is that there's going to be new ideas coming in. There's going to be initiatives. There's going to be new things that are going to be coming in, which are going to lead to better decisions that are going to be made. Additionally, they spoke about how you're going to give people who don't deserve it as much. You're going to give them those positions. However, we are telling you that because of the fact that there's going to be a quota, there's going to be increased competition. And what this means is that there's going to be an increased standard of the politicians that are going to be going in. So if anything, you're going to have more qualified candidates, not less qualified candidates, because of the fact that there is going to be competition. And therefore, there's going to be more people working towards these positions. And therefore, if anything, you're going to have more qualified candidates. And the last thing we'd like to end off with is the fact that by doing this, it's going to be one step closer to eliminating bias, to supporting gender equality. And obviously, this in itself is going to have a long-term effect, a domino effect, if you will. And that the fact that if in Parliament you're saying that women have the right to equal standings, in that case, other things in the population are also going to follow suit with that, and that's why this is very, very crucial. And for all these reasons, we stand firmly and proudly at the motion.
Thank the member of government for that speech, and I invite the member of the opposition, El Kanza, to open up the debate for her corner.
Okay, so we are getting this weird, distorted image from side government that in a society where a woman has to ask her husband to leave the country, where she has to ask his permission to leave the country, where she has to have someone drive her around in her own car. In these situations, that when you institute these quotas, automatically will have this change. But the thing is, that's not going to happen. Because the power dynamics and the patriarchy that exists in those societies is not going to change with this quota that they're trying to institute. And they're not even telling us how that's actually going to happen. They're saying merely we want the image, because that's really what's important. And I'm going to tell you how that image is actually really harmful to society and harmful to women as a whole. So now I want to move on to some points that we kept throwing around about Morocco and like Saudi Arabia and all these countries that like just didn't make sense at all. First of all, in Morocco, it's a constitutional monarchy, so the women having rights and stuff, that was all mostly actually the king's wife, and they don't actually have a lot of power there, and it is just an image, like she pointed out, right? No, right? It is actually just an image, and it's not, they don't actually have as much power as Tim would like us to believe, right? So this idea that like, oh, we're instituting quotas and automatically the problem's fixed isn't true. So the idea that like, that women, I want to move on to why this is a really bad idea, and that shoehorning a policy and forcing women into positions will do nothing to power dynamics, and they won't change. So instead of fixing the situation, we're actually reinforcing these ideas of like of what it means to be feminine and what it means to be feminine in these countries, to be weak and fragile and to need a man to escort you into like the political dynamic of needing men to actually bring you into it versus actually running for office or working to run for office and actually being elected by your constituents and people who want you there and representing someone. Versus in their world where you're just put there and you're seen as a pawn and basically just a body and someone who is a woman. And look, we have women in our parliament. Look, we're so progressive, right? So this idea isn't really like getting us anywhere. So then I want to move on into why earning this position is really important in these countries that they keep bringing up. Not only in Syria and Lebanon and Morocco and all these other countries, but also in the UK and the US and all these, and here too, right? Because when you're being put in these positions, you're not being taken seriously. Because no one sees you as deserving that, right? You're just seen as someone who's standing in for someone else, right? When men are in the same positions as you, we're taking them much more seriously because we say that they went out there and they did it themselves. But when a woman is being put there by a quota, right, what we actually see is that, like, oh, she doesn't really deserve it, right? You know, well, she had, what do you call it, when we see, like, women like Hillary Clinton, when even we don't have a quota, when we have the status quo, and the only way we see what we see is that like just because she was married to like Bill Clinton, we say that she was escorted into like political dynamics, right? She didn't really actually do it herself, even though she's completely competent, she's a completely smart woman, and it has nothing to do with her husband, right? So what we see is that that's playing out in a system where we don't have quotas. So what happens in a system where we do have quotas, and we do have these higher like political power dynamics where women are seen as weaker, right? So, no, thank you. So then what we see is that men have it like, in the same positions will have more power because they're seen as deserving it more. And when you have more power in a system where you're supposed to have equal votes, it really destroys the entire parliamentary system. Okay, so, go.
Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State. Even if everyone said the same things you said, she's still been able to do a great deal as Secretary of State, even if this image of me is true.
Okay. Yeah, she had, okay, who chose her to be Secretary of State? Barack Obama, who was a man, right? She couldn't get into the position of being a president on her own because they kept putting her in the position of like, that she couldn't get into the position because her husband was the only reason that she was there, right? So I want to move on to the point of like, why holding them to a higher standard is actually a burden that we shouldn't put on women in these positions, right? So we think that female politicians, men who are in these same positions, who are politicians in parliament, when they mess up, and that's it. But what we're saying what we're getting from inside government is that these women have a higher calling, right? They have a higher calling to be role models, and they have to do these things to actually like represent everybody, all these women in society. But the thing is, what we're going to get from that is a situation where when women mess up, we're going to see this horrible consequence of they messed up, so that there must be something really wrong with women being in politics, right? There must be something there. We see that the consequences, this didn't happen when women weren't in politics. And if we didn't allow them, it would be much better. So we see that like it places a burden on them and it reinforces the negative stereotypes if they do fail, that it was because they were women and not just because they were people who made mistakes, right? So like I just want to go over some ideas of like this male leadership and how women are going to be completely solitary in this position and be able to speak for themselves. This idea that once they get into these positions, they'll have no one pushing them or trying to use them as pawns. So this idea that like male leadership in parliament won't try to use women as just kind of like bodies and to kind of like push them and get them to say what they want to say, right? Controlling them, right? So what we have is women who are not used to being in these positions and might not have the training as some people who are training to be in those positions. And you see male leadership will take advantage of that and actually use them as bodies to kind of like get their own ideas out because they know that now that there are women there, they can use them for that purpose. And I think that like I'm going to go over this idea of like image of power and why that's really bad. Right? We keep getting this idea from the closing government that the image of power is really important, and it's great to give them a sense of joy because it's like, great, I don't know, they're throwing a party. But like the thing is that this image of power is actually really destructive, especially in these Arab countries where they think they're doing a lot, but at the end of the day, they're really not. And they have no power whatsoever, right? Because really what they just have is a seat that says their name, and that's it. They're not allowed to do anything because They're not allowed to do anything because because the male leadership in essence is still doing everything. Okay. So basically what I told you is that shoehorning women in and like allowing them to just come in because there's a quota doesn't really do anything for us, right? It really just sets seats and it does nothing more than that. Thank you.
Member of opposition to that speech. Now invite Rashid to close up the debate for side government as a whole.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to the closing moments of this debate, which I'm very glad to be a part of. Now, firstly, I would like to, before moving on to my main point of clash, which is this notion of the ideal world presented by the opposition versus the reality that the government spoke about. The second is the actual power that we are giving women from the government versus the symbol of power, this notion of the symbol of power that the opposition spoke about. And the third is the aspirations which will apply to women, which the government brought about, versus the sexist, ideology of the opposition. Now, before I move on to those clash points and the arguments provided within each of those clashes, I would like to rebut my dear speaker who just went before me. Now, firstly, the power dynamics will not change by providing seats in society. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to point out the first major flaw in this ideology. What are they doing? What are they suggesting to improve the power dynamics? At least the government is providing a way to encourage to change the power dynamics. As the government leader of the government pointed out, there has been a history of abuse. There has been a history of oppression against women. This is what we are trying to change. This is what, as the government said, this is what we are trying to change by providing these seats so that the voices of women can be heard. By saying, no, we will not provide you because the power dynamics will not change, that is a very, very sexist approach, saying that no, women will not be able to find their way. Hence, it is faulty thinking on their side because they're just giving up hope and saying, no, we as women are willing to live in a male-dominated society, even though we have the capacity to at least encourage this sort of behavior. That is the first flaw in their argument. Secondly, the speaker of the opposition also had this idea, that by providing a quota, we will actually be getting women off the streets. No, we will not be doing that. We will actually be getting educated women. Like we get educated men to run for these parties, we will also get educated women. We will not get women off the streets who are not trained in this. So their point about getting trained women into the parliament, getting trained women to represent other women's beliefs is basically baseless, because that is not the case. We will not elect untrained women. We will not have untrained women there. Just like we will not have untrained men there, and we will not have untrained women there. So this is the main two flaws that are present in the case that the opposition provided. Now, thirdly, the case that is consistent with the opposition is the power of deserving. The fact that women need to become more deserving. Ladies and gentlemen, the government has pointed this out, which is the problem that the government pointed out. That women are deserving, however, they're not being given the opportunity to have these seats because of the patriarchal society we live in. This is why the government is proposing this quota standard. This is why the government is proposing that we have like a 50-50 male ratio, so that we provide deserving women the opportunity to take leadership, to represent the voice of their women. As my, yes sir.
If women, and I agree with you that women deserve these positions, when you institute a quota, won't society think, well, she didn't get that position because she deserved it, she got that position because there's a quota?
No sir, thank you very much. No, the society will not think that she got the position because of the quota. The society will think that she was a woman who previously would not have gotten the position because of the patriarchal society and male dominance, but now she is able to get that position. Because we have seats, because we have a quota to represent the female voices, that is what the society will think. That is what the women in society will think, and that is what the government stands by, unlike the opposition pointed out. Now, this whole idea of deserving that I was previously speaking of, which my partner brought up the brilliant example of the sati. The tradition of the sati, where an Indian bride in rural areas is burned at the pyre with her husband because she has no right to live apparently after his death. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason that is there because of the panchayat. The panchayat is mostly of elderly male people who are unwilling to change their views. There is no female representation in that. They do not know what it is like to go through the sati. They don't know what it is like to be burned alive at stake. They do not know what this feels like. They do not know what it means like. Even if a woman refuses, the woman is then stoned and burned stake by the men in that society. This is what we want to stop. It is injustices like these in countries which the government has brought up that we are instituting this quota. Yes, ladies and gentlemen.
So, if you say that you somehow directly assume that putting women on this council will stop this burning, first of all, the women on the council have not experienced it, which is a side point. But second of all, how can you? What if husbands of these women on this council do that? How about will the women be burned then? There's no direct correlation between women being on this council and stopping this practice.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition is taking our examples too literally. They are not really identifying the point we are providing here. It was just an example. Yes. No, she does not know, but maybe her mom was burned that way when her husband died. So she does understand the pain. She understands the pain even as a child, which will further encourage us to stop this nonsense that is going on in that society, which is why we're instituting this. At least you're providing an opportunity to bring about that change. What the opposition is saying is that no, we should not even give them the opportunity because it's already hopeless. Now, moving on to my clash argument, the ideal world versus the reality. Now, the leader of the opposition came and said that women are already in power. She herself stated that women in Saudi Arabia want to drive. They've been pleading the government to allow them to drive. However, we can see that there is no change in the decision. In the situation, they are still not allowed to drive. What does that say, ladies and gentlemen? That female voice needs to be represented in the government, which is what the government stands for. Secondly, they also brought about the example of China, where there is no male to female ratio. Why is there a 7-to-1 female ratio? There's a 7-to-1 male to female ratio because of these injustices against women, because of the low hierarchical position that was given to women in societies. This is what we want to change. We want to change this position so that women have a voice, so that in the future there is no 7-to-1 ratio, there is a 7-to-7 ratio, or 1:1 ratio, whatever. Whatever equality ratio that is proposing, so that women in India or people in China do not kill their girls because they now believe that they have an equal opportunity in the world. This is what the government is standing for. As the leader of the government pointed out, there is a reality that women are being oppressed, which is why we're proposing this thing. Now, the actual power and the surface power that the second member of the opposition spoke for, that we will be giving them the symbol of power. She spoke of two instances where we're giving them the symbol of power. Firstly, in the Lebanese government, where she herself mentioned there is no power at all because the government is sort of corrupt or whatever happened. But the problem there is that even men there have no power essentially because the government is also listening to it. At least both men and women have the symbol of power. Women have no power at all. Now, secondly, she also spoke of the idea where women will be blamed for all this and women will be suppressed in society. This is why we're proposing a 50-50 quota. Ladies and gentlemen, one woman can be suppressed, 2 women can be suppressed, 2 women can be, 3 women can be suppressed. But if we have an equal majority, they will not be suppressed. There is a collective voice within women, within the government, within the party, which will stand up for themselves, which will oppose the 50% of other men in the society, which is why we're proposing this quota in the government. And we are proud to propose because of this reason, and this is why we should win. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Government Whip, for that very powerful speech. And now invite the leader, the opposition whip, to close up the debate. I'm sorry, I'm so disoriented. It happened to me too.
Madam Speaker, it's very unpopular in the face of incredible oppression for someone to get up here and tell you, look, let's not take this kind of action. Let's not enact quotas. Because sometimes you just have to wait. Sometimes society just has to catch up. It's unpopular to say these things, and it's unfair to say these things. But it's true. I'm going to talk to you about 3 things. I want to talk to you about how Parliament works. I want to talk to you about how their plan will play out in Parliament. And I want to talk to you about all the negative benefits and negative effects this is going to have on women because of those 2 things. So first of all, let's talk about how Parliament works. And I'm really going to echo Ten's speech here. When he talks to you about, look, Parliaments are representative. They're representative of interests. And a lot of the times, these interests are ethnic interests. That's why we have quotas for parties sometimes. So in this instance, why not have quotas for women's interests? And I want to point out that this ignores a lot of the way parliaments work. Parliaments work because, as he stated, of parties. They work on party systems. So this plan, their plan, would make the most sense if there was one party solely dedicated only to women. But there is all these parties are essentially, like he stated, based on ethnic or local interests. And that's how women are going to be elected. They're going to be elected based on these party interests. That's how this is going to work. That's how parliaments work. Given that, we think supporting this motion would only make sense if, even because of this, they were able to present to you some incredible benefits to women because of their plan. But we don't think they do. Okay? So how is this going to play out in reality? I want to analyze this in 3 ways. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about what country we're talking about, then I want to talk to you about legislation, and then I want to talk to you about society. So there's a lot to get under in this plan, right? So first of all, what countries are we talking about? And we'd say that, like, fine, Britain may have this plan in place, Britain may have quotas, but it doesn't matter, because without it, we think Britain is a progressive enough society that women's interests will be represented regardless. So what we're really talking about, what really matters in this debate, are countries where women are oppressed. Right? Are countries where women don't have the same number of rights as men, in these countries like this, right? So what happens in these kinds of countries? And like, opening government at large, like I think the entire government bench at large brings you a lot of analysis as to how women are oppressed in these societies, how women have to ask for men's permission to vote, how women are subjugated to men in all these instances. And we say, using that analysis, why do you think meaningful change will come about? They tell you a couple of things. They tell you, look, women will be able to represent interests of other women, like sati, for instance, which is an illegal practice already. So I don't know why we're talking about it. But even in this fantasy world where it was not, right? Would this legislation result in change? Would this legislation result in overturning sati? We don't think it would. Why? Because any time ethnic or party interests clash with women's interests, ethnic and party interests will win because women depend on these parties to get into power and because women are subjugated to men who are the party leaders in these societies. Therefore, women's interests will always fall to the wayside.
Point of information, sir?
No, thank you. And so when they tell you, and we'd ultimately say all issues will wind up becoming party issues at some level, and so women's interests will fall to the wayside. But one of the biggest benefits they bring is they tell, look, prenatal care, women will be able to represent their interests with prenatal care because it gets cut so often when it comes to things like deciding the budget. I'll take you at the end of this point. We'd say, if you're talking about budget cuts, you're talking about party issues and how parties want to deal with that. And given that, they're automatically going to subjugate women and push these women's issues to the side and say, look, these issues don't matter, regardless of the fact whether the woman was there to push it for it or not, because women are so subjugated in these societies.
Let's talk about how parliaments work. Parliamentary pressure works by saying, if you don't do this, we're not going to help you get reelected. When a coalition of women is 50% of a party and says, fine, but right after me is another one's coming in and we're going to vote for the same things, the party doesn't have the same ability to pressure these women to vote for their policies.
Yeah, Tim, but that would only make sense if all 50% of the women got together and said, we're going to act like one party, but they can't do that because they're not one party. Just like you said in your speech, right? But what I really want to talk about, right, is we don't think meaningful change is going to come about, but how will society perceive this change? Because that's something that only Alcanza talked about, but ultimately I think all their benefits are hurt by how society perceives this effect. So how does society perceive this effect? We don't think society is going to be as progressive as the government whip was and be able to realize that patriarchy exists, and this is why we're implementing quotas. Because if they all thought like that, we probably wouldn't need to have this policy because we probably have a patriarchy, right? So we think what's really going to happen, and how society is really going to perceive this change, is they're going to say, look, we already subjugate women in our societies, we already grant women less rights in our societies, and now we're putting women into these positions of power because they wouldn't be able to get into these positions of power if it wasn't for us. They wouldn't be able to get into positions of power if it wasn't for these quotas. And that undermines every single woman who deserves to be in parliament, who would have gotten into parliament if it wasn't for the quota system, because they're now all branded as being only there because of the quotas. And we think this has really significant harms. So let's get into the harms and benefits, because I think this is where the debate really comes together. I think if we can show you that this plan has significant harms, then we win the debate. They give you they tell you a couple of things. They tell you, look, there's a symbolic nature of putting women into positions of power. And we'd say the symbolic nature only exists if women were able to enact meaningful legislation, which I've proven to you they can. What happens therefore is that we think women won't be able to enact meaningful legislation, and what this means is that women will be seen to fail. And every single time one woman fails under their ideas of symbolic power, it means that all women in these societies fail, and therefore all women wind up being more subjugated and losing more rights and being seen as more inferior. And we think that's really harmful. We think like what opening opposition stated is also valid, that when parliaments fail, it's going to be pinned on women because of their position in these societies as well. But we think even more than that, it reifies the idea, this plan reifies the idea that women need help, that they are inferior, and that women can't earn these positions without men putting them into these positions. And we think that's really harmful. Ultimately, they come from a good this. Government wants to enact really important legislation which is going to say, look, we're going to help women overall. But in the societies that need it most, this isn't going to be perceived that way. This isn't going to be perceived as helping women. This isn't going to be perceived as empowering women. This is simply going to be a ratifying of the idea that women are inferior to men and therefore they need help to get into positions of power.